All right, welcome to History of Money. Professor Barth here, history professor at Arizona State University. Today's an exciting lecture. We're going to introduce the topic of colonial paper currency. Huge topic in the 18th century. And in fact, colonial America, what later became the United States, will be the first place in the Western world to adopt fiat paper currency. Now, of course, the Chinese had already adopted fiat and used fiat paper currency for a few centuries, back in the late Middle Ages. But in the Western world, colonial America, the colonial Americans are the innovators. And so Part A will talk about bills of credit. I'll define that in a moment. Part B will talk about land banks and discuss some of the opposition to colonial paper money within the colonies themselves. And in Part C, we'll look at the role of currency in the lead up to the American Revolution. All right, so there's the 13 colonies, and we introduced the subject in Lecture 15. And you'll recall the currency of the colonies in the 17th century was a hodgepodge of tobacco money and peltry, country pay in New England, wampum as a subsidiary currency. In the port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Newport, Charleston, coin becomes a bit more common. By the 1670s and 1680s, they're mostly pieces of 8, although there are some Dutch coins as well. They're coming from the Spanish pieces of 8 are coming from piracy and from trade with the Caribbean. More often than not, the coins looked something like this. Many of them were heavily clipped. And so by the 1690s and the early 18th century, many colonists are thirsting for some other alternative to this current system, which was a bit of a mess. And that alternative that they landed upon, of course, was paper money. Paper money. Unlike the Bank of England notes, unlike the notes issued by the Bank of Amsterdam, these paper notes will be a fiat paper currency, irredeemable into gold and silver coin, unlike a banknote. So, when did the first paper money begin in America? Well, the story, in 1690, Britain was at war with France, and the colonial government in Massachusetts decided to levy an expedition against the French at Quebec. The French had colonized what today is Canada, which was right in Massachusetts' backyard. And so the Massachusetts government, under the command of a captain named William Phipps, decided to levy this attack on Quebec. Now, there wasn't any money, gold or silver, in the Massachusetts Treasury to pay the wages of the soldiers or the salaries of the officers. The Massachusetts Treasury at the time was fairly bankrupt. However, the Massachusetts troops were very confident. Captain Phipps was very confident of victory, and they said, you know what, we'll finance this whole expedition from the plunder that we get from Quebec. There was only one problem. The mission failed, and it was an utter disaster for the Massachusetts troops. They came running back home to Massachusetts, failed to take Quebec. The soldiers were on a point of mutiny. There was no money whatsoever in the Massachusetts Treasury, and so in desperation, this was totally unplanned. In desperation, the Massachusetts government fires up the printing press and prints up these. The first emission was in December of 1690. December of 1690, and it was a bill of credit, a paper currency, and that's what they paid the soldiers. Now, apparently, according to the first-hand accounts, the soldiers were almost mutinous because of that. They had expected coin. Instead, they get this slip of paper, and they're told this is your payment. But the first emission in December of 1690, 9,000 pounds worth of these notes, in pounds sterling, that is. So the unit of account, 9,000 pounds. By the way, if there's any confusion why it says February 1690, according to the old calendar, the year didn't change until after March. So we would call this February of 1691. Back then it was 1690. But in any event, nobody had any idea at the time that this would open up an entire new currency system. It's at first was seen as a temporary expedient, just a way to stop the soldiers from mutinying, and the currency will pass, and eventually the currency will be the notes will be retired, and nothing else will be made of it. The initial emission was 9,000 pounds. By the 1750s, the Massachusetts government had issued roughly 600,000 pounds of paper bills. It wasn't temporary. It was here to stay. So let's go. Let's take a look at these bills of credit. Well, these bills of credit, as already mentioned, were a fiat money, meaning they had their value only because the government had declared via legislative fiat or decree that these notes had value. The government declared that these notes were legal tender, first in public payments, and then eventually the Massachusetts government said in private payments as well, legal tender. And so the notes have what we would call extrinsic value instead of intrinsic value. There's no value in and of themselves, nor do they represent anything with intrinsic value, like a Bank of England banknote. It's not representative money. It's obviously not commodity money. It's fiat money. It's irredeemable or inconvertible. The Massachusetts government was not obligated by any law to redeem these paper notes for silver coin if presented the notes. No backing by any commodity. These notes were issued by the government, not by a bank. So all the emissions of these notes were ordered by the legislature, and then the treasurer was in charge of overseeing the printing of those notes, but they were all voted in by the legislature. This is not our system of money today. So we have a fiat money in the United States today. We'll talk about the Federal Reserve later. But it's not government issued in a sense that, Congress doesn't have debates on the floor of the House about how many dollars we ought to have in circulation. Those debates happened in colonial America through most of the 18th century. Imagine how different that would make our monetary system today if the question of how many notes we ought to have in circulation was a matter for Congress to decide. Some people might like that idea. Other people would be horrified by a prospect like that one. Nevertheless, that's how this was done. And then the notes were used once they were printed. They were in the office of the treasurer, and then the state treasurer paid out those notes for any government expenses. In financing war, if the colony needed to buy military equipment, needed to pay salaries for officers, wages for soldiers, they needed to construct new ships. The treasurer would use these printed notes, these bills of credit, and pay whoever it was they needed to pay, or for just basic peacetime public expenditures. if the colony wanted to build a road, a bridge, any sort of project of that sort. Colonial bills of credit were used to finance those projects. But it was not legal tender laws alone which gave value to the notes. Taxes played a major role in giving value to the notes and encouraging their circulation. Let me give you this example. Let's say a colonial legislature, has this big expense. They are unable or unwilling to tax the people, 10,000 pounds worth of coin or country pay in the short term, and so they decide to finance this expenditure instead by printing 10,000 pounds worth of these bills of credit. So the legislature orders this emission. Usually, in most cases, that same statute was accompanied by new taxes to give backing to these notes. I'm using this example here, but varied depending on the colony and depending on the time you're talking about. But in this example, 10,000 pound emission, and then the government arranged for taxes of 2,000 pounds every year in which you could spend in meeting those tax payments. You could use these paper notes to settle those tax payments in lieu of or instead of silver coin. You could use these paper notes. And then within 5 years, 5 times 2 equals 10, the entire mission has been paid off. It's been retired. It's been drawn back in by the government. The debt has been paid off. Now, this is also where we get the term bills of credit. This is why this currency is called bills of credit. Let's look at the language on this note. This indented or printed bill of 20 shillings due from the Massachusetts colony to the possessor shall be in value equal to money and shall be accordingly accepted by the treasurer, and then it goes on. What's it saying here? The Massachusetts government had this expense. Instead of taxing the people right away, they printed these notes, but what these notes really represent, it's a debt that the Massachusetts government owes because they decided not to tax. They didn't have the money, and so they issue these notes, and it's a debt owed by the Massachusetts government. Well, who's the creditor? Who's the creditor? The creditor is the note holder. Whoever possesses this note is the creditor. Why? Because at any time when tax time comes around, that note holder can then use this paper note and settle his taxes with this paper note instead of paying silver coin. And when he presents that note to the Massachusetts government in payment of those taxes, the Massachusetts government is obligated by law to judge this note as, quote, equal or in value equal to money. In value equal to money or to silver coin is what that means there. And so this is a bill of credit. The note holder is the creditor, and this gives value to the note. And so, if you were out there and you saw this paper note and you're like, are you kidding me? This has value. This is just a piece of paper. Why does this have any value? Well, it has value because if there's one thing in life you can depend on. There's one thing in life you can totally rely on, dealing with. What do they say? Death and taxes. Death and taxes. And so one way or another, you're going to have to pay taxes. And if you can pay those taxes with these notes instead of hard silver coin, you're going to do it. And that's what gives circulation to the notes. Wartime finance was really the big impetus behind many of these emissions of paper currency, of bills of credit, between 1690 and 1714, and then later between 1740 and 1763. Britain and France were at war, and these were really global conflicts, and many of the conflicts spilled over into the Americas. The French had colonies in the Caribbean, the French had colonies in Canada, in Louisiana, and so colonial governments needed to finance various military expenditures during those wars, and bills of credit did the trick. It was an easy way to raise money in the short term without having to tax the people with silver coin they didn't have in the first place, or with country pay and tobacco money, which is just, again, cumbersome. That's not going to do the trick either. Paper currency will do the trick. And it functions actually fairly well for a while. And the notes become more intricate and sophisticated in design. This is a later United States bill of credit. So I had an internship all the way back in 2014 with the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was founded by Benjamin Franklin. I did a month-long internship there, and I was doing research for my book and for a later project that I would like to do on paper currency. And so I had a camera there, and so I handled a lot of these notes. They're really, really cool. And the photographs that you'll see in the upcoming slides are photographs that I took at the archives. They had a requirement that I have their ruler in all of my photographs, but for our purposes here, I'll give the credit. All of these photos are from the Library Company. But, I mean, this is a later note. This is from New Jersey in 1764. So the printing technique became more advanced as the decades wore on. And really, really cool notes. I believe this one was Pennsylvania. This one was a Pennsylvania note. Look at that. Really beautiful note. Love that note. This is one of my favorite notes, actually. A 50-shilling note. Bill of credit. 20-shilling note, 15-shilling note. By the way, look at that. Printed by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a printer, among many other things, in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin was a major champion of paper currency in Pennsylvania. In fact, Benjamin Franklin's very first pamphlet that he authored, major pamphlet, was a pamphlet in defense of paper currency. We're going to stop there because there was another type of paper currency that was issued at the same time in colonial America. It was issued in a slightly different way. I'm not going to dwell too long on it, but they were called land banks. I want to briefly discuss that, and then I also want to talk about, in part B, opposition to paper money, because there was a lot of support among people like Benjamin Franklin, there was a whole lot of opposition in the colonies and opposition from Britain to this newfangled currency. And so we will look at that for part B. See you there.